So my journey up to this point has been over a slow period of time of really bubbling up a convergence of issues over a number of years. I pastored in a traditional city church for 21 years, and I was not able to live near the church. I couldn't afford to live in the city, and so as with all the pastoral staff, we lived 30 to 45 minutes away. And yet my education really rooted a theology of place, so I lived with that confliction for a lot of years. So around a theology of place, around all that comes around that, and then my interest around the city, and that the city shapes culture, and yet churches had been kind of migrating outside of the city core. And so out of this a sense of call to the city and wanting to move in deeply. And then also there was a number of years of my own hunger for a deeper experience of community, more localized and integrated faith expression. And so a variety of things that just kind of converged over a number of years. And then that kind of came together with my denomination's invitation to kind of pioneer as like an urban missionary. And so I kind of took the plunge 5 years ago and intentionally moved into this key community that is one of the most unchurched communities in North America. And so very little Christian witness and gospel expression in this community. It's also a community that kind of shapes and defines the city of Vancouver. So wanting to intentionally moved in, so that's what I did, as I moved into a large house and began a process. And I have lived most of my life on adrenaline and deadlines and productivity and so there was a variety of things that I kind of started with, as a few assumptions that I started with. One is that I wasn't going to do anything prescriptive to begin with. I wasn't going to come in and launch. I felt like if the call was to pioneer, that I needed to first take this posture of radically listening. And so that's really what I started with, is that I wanted to bring biblical reflection, into my context. And I needed to really know my context, not just from data as an outsider, but to really embed in. And so that took time. So one of the things that I realized very quickly here is that I have lived most of my life at a fairly good speed, and valued efficiency and productivity, and I determined that I couldn't be present with people and be busy. So it took almost a year and a half of reorienting my entire lifestyle. The first year I kept saying, I need more margin, I need more margin. I also started to play with the idea that I observed that Jesus primarily ministered in serendipitous moments, and I started to wonder, as I was given this invitation to kind of rewrite my life, could I actually orchestrate my life that would believe that again? I'm old enough that I am weary of what the best that we can bring to the table in our efficiency, in our experience, in our education. I wanted that much more, what God could set up. So I started to really give attention more to lifestyle. How could I belong versus to this group of people and who they were, and extreme diversity of my neighborhood that I am. And so I began to just show up at all the community events, just starting to participate. I would rarely run into any Christian at any just the community events. This is a really engaged community. I'd intentionally sit on my porch. I'm 5 feet from the sidewalk, and it's a dog walking community, and so I could talk to people all day. So just started to extend hospitality, wanted to shape my lifestyle really around hospitality. I started to really reflect on biblical hospitality to the stranger, and started to confront that I had really only experienced primarily hospitality to friends and family. and that biblical radical hospitality was primarily to the stranger. And my life had been fairly compartmentalized, and I'd really seen that hospitality was yet another thing to do. So it was those things that were a very slow transition of starting to embrace and live more deeply into my theology around those practices. And there was a shift toward practices versus kind of methods and techniques. And so those slow practices really around sharing meals together. And so we started, I allowed a community house to develop here and invited people to that were in transition and holding space for people in transition. And so I made rooms available for people that needed space. So it was a practical thing. It helped pay the rent, and it also enabled me to have this high volume of contact with people. So now I have 6 bedrooms in this 100-year-old house, and there's been, I don't know, maybe 240 people that have stayed here in the last 5 years. And so out of that practices, we developed having regular community meals. And I saw the power of sharing a meal together. Simple, good food around a table with diversity. The magic of the Spirit, when Jesus is kind of the guest and host. When there's diversity of people, and you are sharing food together, your common humanity elevates. And I started to taste, I say this gently, but really almost kind of like divine encounters almost regularly, by just making space for people around shared food, around being available in the neighborhood, how the openness for relationship and invitation. You know, Vancouver's known as kind of a lonely city, that we have the busyness. There's lots of things that have contributed to that, but I have started to wrestle with how do we find a new normal and actually invite people into that. I think giving people tastes of the kingdom. One of the things that I wanted to think about is, how do I live the message? If I knew that the front end wasn't going to be proclamation, but how was I to embody the gospel? And so what were going to be those practices, those rhythms that would actually reflect the gospel, that would awaken people to hunger and to know God. So those were in the early stages. That was a very slow process to think more deeply about what Scripture says about how to live, and then to listen more intently to whom my neighbors are, and the history of the community here. So the posture was very different versus this sense that I'm coming and bringing God. But I live in this 100-year-old house that I'm always reminded that there's been a lot of life lived in this house prior to me. And I think that's the posture that, when I prayer walk around the neighborhood, that there's been a lot of God activity for decades before I ever got here. And to enter with that sense of humility and recognition and partnership, that you're joining with people before you and with what God is already doing. And so the posture has been very different than most of my ministry life. Last year I started just hosting soup nights for the neighborhood. And I'd been for a couple of years just inviting people for meals and doing Christmas open houses that kind of nudged over a couple of years. And then it just seemed the right timing to move it up a bit. And so we started an email list within our neighborhood and invited people for a simple meal. Just made some homemade soup and homemade bread, and very simple. And I think the first time we had 17 people. And last month we had 47 of my immediate neighbors. And every decade, from mid-20s to mid-70s. And I remember looking back, and people have loved it. there's just something that it ignites this wild diversity of people that have come together. And they have just, I'm thinking this is very simple things, but it has been like this profound impact that people have communicated to me of their life in the neighborhood. And I'm trying to start a porch movement here. These are all these old Edwardian homes that have porches, and so I've gotten a few neighbors to put chairs out on their porches and start to be more present. And so it's been kind of fun to move the backyard more into the front. And yesterday, actually, I was sitting on the porch. It was a warm evening, around 5 o'clock, and this woman stopped by, was walking her dog, and stopped to chat. She's actually, I'd never met her before, and she lives just around the corner. And she's grew up in this neighborhood. And she's about my age, single, and anyway, she ended up opening up, sharing quite a bit of her life within about 45 minutes. And so she's already asked that if she could come by for tea in a couple days, and then she is unemployed right now, and shared her dream of maybe starting to make, she's Italian, and making lasagna and selling it. And so I said yes, I'd buy some, and invited her that we could cook together, and I would facilitate having a meal for her. And I think just such simple things of being available and attentive. It's not a passive stance. It's a very active stance where there's this living with a sense of ambiguity, but with this sense of openness and attentiveness, and without insisting on this game plan. That you are kind of cooperating with God's game plan. So it's a very active stance, and this attentiveness to who is available and orchestrating, and then you inviting people into your life, and you're willing to share life with them. And so it has enriched mine. I have loved this chapter of my life. I am having a blast. I would never go back to status quo. This is, I think that there's a way of living that is deeply satisfying and challenging, and is filled with joy beyond what we could ever imagine. I think God invites us to a life of following Him that is this wild adventure, and that is way beyond, that I just think many years I settled for working hard for God productively, but was short on joy. And there is this deep joy that I think God invites us when our lives become more integrated and less fragmented, and is deeply rooted in a place that roots us with other people.